She went back to staring at the sheep. "The Baron owns this country," said the servant. "It is his law." The look Granny Aiken gave him turned the man's hair white. That was the story anyway. But all stories about Granny Aiken had a bit of fairy tale about them. "If it is as ye say, his law, then let him break it and see how things may then be," she said. A few hours later, the Baron sent his bailiff, who was far more important but had known Granny Aiken for longer. He said, "Mrs. Aiken, the Baron requests that you use your influence to save his dog. He will happily give you $50 to help ease this difficult situation. I am sure you can see how this will benefit everyone concerned." Granny smoked her pipe and stared at the new lambs and said, "Ye speak for your master speaks for his dog. Who speaks for the hills? Where is the Baron, that the law be break for him?" They said that when the Baron was told this, he went very quiet. But although he was pompous and often unreasonable and far too haughty, he was not stupid. In the evening he walked up to the hut and sat down on the turf nearby. After a while, Granny Aiken said, "Can I help you, my lord?" "Granny Aiken, I plead for the life of my dog," said the Baron. "Bring ye siller, bring ye gilt," said Granny Aiken. "No silver, no gold," said the Baron. "Good. A law that is break by siller or gilt is no worthwhile law, and so, my lord." "I plead, Granny Aiken." "Ye try to break the law with a word?" "That's right, Granny Aiken." Granny Aiken, the story went, stared at the sunset for a while and then said, "Then be down at a little old stone barn at Doran tomorrow, and we'll see if an old dog can learn new tricks. There will be a reckoning. Good night to ye." Most of the village was hanging around the old stone barn the next morning. Granny arrived with one of the smaller farm wagons. It held a ewe with her newborn lamb. She put them in the barn. Some of the men turned up with the dog. It was nervy and snappy, having spent the night chained up in a shed, and kept trying to bite the men who were holding it by 2 leather straps. It was hairy, it had fangs. The Baron rode up with the bailiff. Granny Aiken nodded at them and opened the barn door. "You're putting the dog into the barn with the sheep, Mrs. Aiken," said the bailiff. "Do you want it to choke to death on lamb?" This didn't get much of a laugh. No one really liked the bailiff. "We shall see," said Granny. The men dragged the dog to the doorway, threw it inside the barn, and slammed the door quickly. People rushed to the little windows. There was the bleating of the lamb, a growl from the dog, and then a baa from the lamb's mother. But this wasn't the normal baa of a sheep. It had an edge to it. Something hit the door, and it bounced on its hinges. Inside, the dog yelped. Granny Aiken picked up Tiffany and held her up to a window. The shaken dog was trying to get to his feet, but it didn't manage it before the ewe charged it again, 70 pounds of enraged sheep slamming into it like a battering ram. Granny lowered Tiffany again and lit her pipe. She puffed it peacefully as the building behind her shook and the dog yelped and whimpered. After a couple of minutes, she nodded at the men. They opened the door. The dog came out limping on 3 legs, but it hadn't managed to get more than a few feet before the ewe shot out behind it and butted it so hard that it rolled over. It lay still. Perhaps it had learned what would happen if it tried to get up again. Granny Aiken had nodded to the men, who grabbed the sheep and dragged it back into the barn. The Baron had been watching with his mouth open. "He killed a wild boar last year," he said. "What did you do to him?" "He'll mend," said Granny Aiken, carefully ignoring the question. "'Tis mostly his pride that's hurt, but he won't look at the sheep again. You have my thumb on that." And she licked her right thumb and held it out. After a moment's hesitation, the Baron licked his thumb, reached down and pressed it against hers. Everyone knew what it meant. On the chalk, a thumb bargain was unbreakable. "For you, at a word, the law was break," said Granny Aiken. "Will you mind that? Ye who sit in judgment, will you remember this day? You'll have cause to." The Baron nodded to her. "I'll do," said Granny Aiken, and their thumbs parted. Next day, the Baron technically did give Granny Aiken gold, but it was only the gold-coloured foil of an ounce of Jolly Sailor. the cheap and horrible pipe tobacco that was the only one Granny Aiken would ever smoke. She was always in a bad mood if the peddlers were late and she'd run out. You couldn't bribe Granny Aiken for all the gold in the world, but you could definitely attract her attention with an ounce of jolly sailor. Things were a lot easier after that. The bailiff was a little less unpleasant when rents were late. The Baron was a little more polite to people, and Tiffany's father said one night after 2 beers that the Baron had been shown what happens when sheep rise up, and things might be different one day. And her mother hissed at him not to talk like that, because you never knew who was listening. And one day, Tiffany heard him telling her mother quietly, "'Twas an old shepherd's trick, that's all. An old ewe will fight like a lion for her lamb. We all know that." That was how it worked. No magic at all. But that time, it had been magic. And it didn't stop being magic just because she found out how it was done. The Knack-Mack Feagles were watching Tiffany carefully, with occasional longing glances at the bottle of special sheep liniment. "I haven't even found the witch's school," she thought. "I don't know a single spell. I don't even have a pointy hat. My talents are an instinct for making cheese and not running around panicking when things go wrong. Oh, and I've got a toad. And I don't understand half of what these little men are saying, but they know who's taken my brother. Somehow I don't think the Baron would have a clue how to deal with this. I don't either, but I think I can be clueless in more sensible ways. I remember a lot of things about Granny Aiken," she said. "What do you want me to do?" "The Kelder sent us," said Rob Anybody. "She sensed the Queen coming. She kenned there was going to be trouble. She told us it's going to be bad. Find the new hag who's kin to Granny Aiken. She'll ken what to do." Tiffany looked at the hundreds of expectant faces. Some of the Feagles had feathers in their hair and necklaces of mole teeth. You could tell someone with half his face dyed dark blue and a sword as big as he was that you weren't really a witch. You couldn't disappoint someone like that. "And will you help me get my brother back?" she said. The Feagle's expressions didn't change. She tried again. "Can you help me steal my brother back from the Queen?" Hundreds of small yet ugly faces brightened up considerably. "Ach, now you're talking our language," said Rob Anybody. "Not quite," said Tiffany. "Can you all just wait a moment? I'll just pack some things," she said, trying to sound as if she knew what she was doing. She put the cork back on the bottle of special sheep liniment. The Knack-Mack Feagles sighed. She darted back into the kitchen, found a sack, took some bandages and ointments out of the medicine box, added the bottle of special sheep liniment because her father said it always did him good, and, as an afterthought, added the book Diseases of the Sheep, and picked up the frying pan. Both might come in useful. The little men were nowhere to be seen when she went back into the dairy. She knew she ought to tell her parents what was happening, but it wouldn't work. It'd be telling stories. Anyway, with any luck, she could get Wentworth back before she was even missed, but just in case. She kept a diary in the dairy. Cheese needed to be kept track of, and she always wrote down details of the amount of butter she'd made and how much milk she'd been using. She turned to a fresh page, picked up her pencil, and with her tongue sticking out of the corner of her mouth, began to write. The Knack-Mack Feagles gradually reappeared. They didn't obviously step out from behind things, and they certainly didn't pop magically into existence. They appeared in the same way that faces appear in clouds and fires. They seemed to turn up if you just looked hard enough and wanted to see them. They watched the moving pencil in awe, and she could hear them murmuring, "Look at that writing. Stick new, will ye, Bobbin? Along, that's hag business." "Hag, she has the kenning of the writing, sure enough. But you no write down our names, mistress? Aye, a body can be put in prison if they have written evidence." Tiffany stopped writing and read the note. "Dear Mum and Dad, I have gone to look for Wentworth. I am perfectly, probably, quite safe because I am with some friends, acquaintances, people who knew Granny. P.S. The cheese on rack 3 will need turning tomorrow if I'm not back. Love, Tiffany." Tiffany looked up at Rob Anybody, who had shinned up the table leg and was watching the pencil intently, in case it wrote something dangerous. "You could have just come and asked me right at the start," she said. "We didn't ken it was thee we were looking for, mistress. Lots of big job women walking around this farm. We didn't ken it was thee until you caught Daft Woolly. It might not be, thought Tiffany. Yes, but stealing the sheep and the eggs, there was no need for that, she said sternly. But they wasn't nailed down, mistress, said Rob Anybody, as if that was an excuse. You can't nail down an egg, snapped Tiffany. Ah, well, you'd have the kenning away stuff like that, mistress, said Rob Anybody. I sees you done with the writing, so we'd best be going. Ye has a besom? Broomstick, murmured the toad. No, said Tiffany. The important thing about magic, she added haughtily, is to know when not to use it. Fair enough, said Rob Anybody, sliding back down the table leg. Come here, Daft Woolly. One of the Feagles that looked very much like that morning's egg thief came and stood by Rob Anybody, and they both bent over slightly. If you'd care to step on us, mistress, said Rob Anybody. Before Tiffany could open her mouth, the toad said out of the corner of its mouth, and being a toad that means quite a lot of corner, one Feagle can lift a grown man. You couldn't squash one if you tried. I don't want to try. Tiffany very cautiously raised a big boot. Daft Woolly ran underneath it, and she felt the boot being pushed upwards. She might as well have trodden on a brick. Now t'other wee booty, said Rob Anybody. I'll fall over. Nay, we're good at this. And then Tiffany was standing up on two pixies. She felt them moving backwards and forwards underneath her, keeping her balanced. She felt quite secure, though. It was just like wearing really thick soles. Let's go, said Rob Anybody, down below. And don't worry about yon pussycat scraffing the wee birdies. Some of the lads are staying behind to mind things. Ratbag crept along a branch. He wasn't a cat who was good at changing the ways, he thought, but he was good at finding nests. He'd heard the cheeping from the other end of the garden, and even from the bottom of the tree he'd been able to see 3 little yellow beaks in the nest. Now he advanced, dribbling. Nearly there. 3 Knack-Mack Feagles pulled off their straw beaks and grinned happily at him. Hello, Mr. Pussycat, said one of them. You didn't learn, do you? Cheep,